Today I'm shopping my stash and using what I have. Welcome to my channel. I'm Jenny from jennycarddesigns, bringing paper crafting tutorials and inspiration to all of you. I hope you enjoy. In today's video, I'm going to dig through some of my supplies and come up with a card project just using what I have. I'm not going to buy anything new. I'm just going to dig into my stuff and see what I can come up with. I'm going to start off with these Altenew flowers. This is called the Incredible Flower Stamp Set, and it's got some gigantic large florals. And I really like this set because you can color it any color you want. It's so easy to color, and you'll see what I mean in just a minute. So I've got a stamping tool here, and I've got a couple of pieces of white cardstock, and this is a nice smooth white cardstock. I'm just going to pull the stamps out from the stamp set and get them laid down on my cardstock where I want them. I'll close the door of my stamping tool and pick those stamps up, and then I'm going to reposition my cardstock back into the corners so that if I need to stamp a second time, my cardstock is positioned in the corners and I can do that without worrying. So first thing I'm going to do is treat this paper with an anti-static powder tool. Because I want to heat emboss these images, this anti-static powder will help keep any static or oils off of my cardstock so I can stamp without any issues. So I have a clear sticky ink. This is Versamark ink, and I'm going to ink up these stamps really good, making sure I get a good coverage. I'll close the door of my stamping tool and press. I have this little pressure tool that I made, and it just helps me apply pressure over the door of my stamping tool, and I can press down and get firm, even pressure. So I'll pick up the door and check out my images to make sure that they stamped well. You can't see this on screen, but I can see it just fine. I'm going to grab some embossing powder, and this stuff was really the magic that made me fall in love with card making. So what happens is you have this clear sticky ink and you have this powder that you sprinkle over top of your stamped image. And that anti-static powder tool that we applied will help make sure that those little flecks of embossing powder don't stick to the cardstock or anywhere else that you don't want it, other than that clear sticky ink. So I can just tap off the cardstock and all of the embossing powder will fall away. I'll just make sure that my images are covered with embossing powder, nice and good. And then all of this excess embossing powder will just get funneled right back into my little jar, and I won't lose any. This stuff lasts forever. So I have a heat gun here, and you want to make sure that your heat gun is good and hot before you bring it to your paper. So I just allow it to warm up for a few seconds before I heat up my image, because the more you hold the heat gun to the paper, the more likely it is to warp. So I want this to melt my embossing powder very quickly. I'll just hold my heat gun over top of the embossing powder until it becomes smooth and melted. And then this is the result. Look at that beautiful gold shine. This just elevates your card projects to a whole nother level. These images turned out really great. So now I'm going to move over to ink blending over top of these flowers to color them in. I have some Distress Oxide inks along with some blending tools. Now this Distress Oxide ink is a pigment ink. So it's opaque and it has a solid coverage and they blend really well. So what I'm going to do is just ink up these flowers with a darker color in the center and then sort of fade it out to the edge. So I'm starting with a color called Peacock Feathers right in the center of this flower. And then I'm blending over top of that color with another color, which is Mermaid Lagoon. And I'll just blend those together and gradually bring that color out to the edge of the flower. And then for my final color, I'm going to use Broken China. And these colors, I feel like they just work really well together and create such an intense color. So I'm just going to go back over top of the colors that I've applied and blend those in and intensify the color just a little bit and making sure that I get a smooth, seamless transition of color from the teal all the way out to that light blue. Okay. And then I'm going to grab a dry cloth and just rub this cloth over top of the embossing powder. Because that embossing powder is smooth and shiny, it will resist the ink that we're applying over top of it. So rather than have it smudge or, kind of dull my embossing powder, I just want to wipe it away. So I've gone ahead and done the same color combination to the other two flowers and just blended everything in together and then wipe away the excess ink with my dry cloth. And now we're ready to move on to the next step. I happen to have the coordinating dies for these flowers to cut them out. These are simple enough to cut out by hand, but the coordinating dies make it look nice and clean cut. So I'm just going to lay these dies over top of my flowers. I'll grab a little bit of washi tape and just tape those little dies in place. And these are simple to line up. I'm just making sure that the die fits all the way around that outline of the flower. I'll pop these over all three of my flowers, and then I'm going to run them through my die cut machine. I have a Spellbinders Platinum 6 die cutting machine. I'm using a base plate and 2 cutting plates. I'll pop my dies on top of the first cutting plate, lay another cutting plate on top, and just crank that through the die cutting machine. And then check this out. We have these beautiful flowers all cut out. And what I like about ink blending these flowers is that it gets the ink like right to the edge of the cardstock and there's no like white edge or anything. So it looks really nice. So before I finish up with my die cut machine, I'm going to cut out a layer of black cardstock to back these flowers on. This will help create a sort of thicker, stronger flower, and it also will create a little bit of a shadow underneath to give it a little bit of depth. So I'll add some liquid glue to the back of my flowers and adhere them onto the black layer. I really like stacking my die cuts with heavyweight cardstock. It makes it feel like a nice thick embellishment and like a quality piece of ephemera. Once I have my black cardstock glued to my flowers, we'll be ready to move on to the next step. I'm just going to grab a cloth and wipe away any of that ink that might be sitting on top or any of that glue that might be seeping out from the sides of my flower. All right, so I have a card base here. This is an A7 or 5x7 card base, and I'm using a nice heavyweight cardstock because I love a thick card base. I like the feel of it. So I'm just kind of playing around with my flowers, and I decided I wanted to add some pretty blue glitter cardstock. I cut out a piece that measures 6 1/4 by 4 1/4. And then I thought about using an embossing folder to add some texture. I've never done that with glitter cardstock, so I wanted to see what the result would look like, if it would be even worth doing. So I thought I'd test it out. So here we go. I've run this through my die cut machine, and you can barely see the texture. When I bring it up real close to the camera, you can see that pattern that's there. There's a little bit of raised texture. So I don't think that you would really notice it unless you knew what to look for. Once it's on the card base, you kind of can't see it at all. So I've got another piece of black cardstock here. I'm going to create a little black border to go around my glitter cardstock. I felt like that glitter cardstock really packed a punch and it needed just a little bit of a frame to tone it down just a little bit. So I cut a piece that measures 4 1/2 by 6 1/2, and then I'm just going to mat my glitter cardstock onto this black layer. And I think it just helps frame it out and create a nice separation between the glitter and the card base. So I'll use my liquid glue and I'll glue the back of this panel to the black cardstock. And I'll just eyeball this, making sure that I get it centered. I'm going to pull in my dry cloth once again. I find this is a really helpful tip when gluing panels down. Being able to wipe away that liquid glue with a dry cloth, it doesn't leave any marks behind. So I like that little cloth on hand for all kinds of things. So I'll glue this layered panel onto my card base. And then I need one more layer to be able to stack my flowers on because I feel like they'll get lost with that glitter cardstock. So I've got another piece of white cardstock and I'm going to cut a piece that measures 3 3/4 by 5 3/4. And this allows me to have a nice 1/2 inch blue glitter border. And then the last thing I want to do to this piece is just put a few score lines in it to create a little bit of texture. I don't know, just some interest in that white cardstock. So I'm just scoring 3 little lines in this paper closer to the bottom, and it just creates a little bit of fun interest. So I'm going to apply this to my glitter cardstock using liquid glue. Now, this was a mistake. Liquid glue and glitter cardstock aren't friends. They don't like each other very much. So we have to give them a sort of mediator in between. I ended up having to come back and apply some double-sided tape to the back of this panel and then apply my liquid glue. And then I set something heavy on top to let everything seal together and hold in place. And now I'm ready to move on to layering up my flowers. I'm just trying to figure out my placement. I'm not sure how it's going to look or how I'm going to lay them out. So I decided the next best thing for me is to figure out what sentiment I'm going to use and get that onto my card base. And then I can figure out where these flowers are going to go. I found a really nice, encouraging sentiment. This comes from the stamp set Look for the Rainbows from Simon Says Stamp. And the sentiment says, "Somewhere over the rainbow, skies are blue, and the dreams you dare to dream really do come true." This card is for my boss's wife. I'm making it so that he can give her some encouragement for a project she's working on. So I've got my card panel loaded back up into my stamping tool. I have now treated it with my anti-static powder tool because I want to heat emboss this sentiment as well. I'm going to pick up my stamps with the door of the MISTI, and I want to make sure using the grid lines of my stamping tool that I can see the sentiment is nice and straight. I've come way too far in this project to end up with a crooked sentiment. So I'm going to stamp with my most favorite black ink. This is VersaFine Onyx Black ink. It's a oil-based pigment ink, so it stamps beautifully, but it does take some time to dry. So this is why I want to heat emboss this one. So I stamp it twice to make sure I have a nice dark coverage. And then I'm going to grab some clear embossing powder. This clear embossing powder is going to cover the sentiment, but it's going to be clear, obviously, but it's going to protect the sentiment so that it doesn't get smudged or anything. So I sprinkle my embossing powder on, and I'll funnel the rest of it back into the little jar. And then I've got my heat gun warming up off to the side, and I'll bring this to my card very quickly, heat it up. And sometimes I pull the gun away and give it a second and then bring the gun back in just because this is all glued down and I don't want the cardstock to warp and have anything peel up. And then the last thing we're going to do is start attaching these flowers. So I'm figuring out my placement. The big flower is going to be glued directly down to the card base. So I'll apply a little bit of liquid glue just in the center. I don't want to glue it super flat. I want it to be able to have a little bit of sort of lift. And I also want to let it break outside of that confined space. I want it to break outside of the layered panels. So it just gives it a little bit of like a three-dimensional look. And then for the other two flowers, I'm going to pop them up with some foam squares. So I just pick up the foam squares, pop them onto the back, remove the release paper, and then I add a little dot of glue on the back of each foam square. What this does is it allows me to shift that flower around and make sure I get the placement that I want, and I have a little bit of wiggle room. So I want these flowers to sort of hug that little greeting and just frame it nicely. So once I have the first flower popped on, I'll do the same thing to the second flower, a little bit of foam squares, a little bit of liquid glue, and then pop it into the corner. And then I'm totally happy with the way this whole card has come together. I love the way it looks. And then the last thing I want to do is add some embellishments just to bring a little bit more life to this card. And then I also want to tie that gold embossing powder into the card. As it stands, it's the only gold on the card. So just having another gold element will help everything flow together nicely. So I have some flat back pearls, and there are a bunch of different sizes here. And I really like having multiple sizes of embellishments. I think it just creates a really nice look. So I have a little jewel picker here, and I'm going to pick up a bunch of these little pearls and place them around my card, and I'm going to use all different sizes. I like to create little clusters of 2 and 3, and multiple sizes in each cluster. It creates a nice flow and movement on the card. And then it also frames out that sentiment nicely. So I add a couple around the sentiment. I add some down in the bottom corner where there's that little extra bit of white with nothing there. And then I also added a couple on top of the flowers. I think it looks really pretty. Once I get my pearls in place, I will pick them up with my jewel picker and pop a little tiny bit of glue and then place the pearl back down on top of the glue. And then that will hold it into place. So you don't need much glue here, just the tiniest little drop. So I'm being careful not to add too much so that it doesn't ooze out over my flowers. And then here we go. Our card project is complete. This turned out absolutely stunning. I love the way it looks, the colors and the glitter and the embossing and the gold, everything about it. It just screams elegance. All right, so that's going to be it for today's video. I hope that you enjoyed this inspiration of using what you have. Dig through your stash, see what you can find, and make an encouragement card for somebody in your life. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, I would love for you to do so. Click like on this video if you enjoyed this content. Leave me a comment down below if you'd like anything about this video, if you just want to say hi, or if you'd like to share some future projects that you'd like to see on my YouTube channel. Coming up on screen are a couple of videos I think you may enjoy. Have yourself a lovely day, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!